If the reports are to be believed, then it only took a mere 2 words for America's Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to turn himself and his underlings into war criminals. Kill everybody. According to an investigation by the Washington Post, drawing on purportedly well-placed insiders within the Pentagon, Hegseth gave those orders in early September after the United States carried out the first of many airstrikes against purported narco-trafficking drug boats. That airstrike had hit a fast boat with 11 people on board, and at least 2 of those people survived, or at least they did, until a follow-up missile strike killed them in the water. The allegations have set off a firestorm in Washington, with Democrats and Republicans vowing to work together and get to the bottom of what happened. According to Hegseth himself, there's nothing to see. An admiral ordered the second strike. Hegseth believed it to be justified, and America, according to him, would happily do it again. According to the vast majority of US and international experts on military law, if the allegations against Hegseth are true, then that would constitute a blatant and obvious war crime in an air campaign that's already of questionable legality. In a worst-case scenario, the allegations won't just end the career of one of the most powerful men in the Pentagon, they'll shatter what remains of the global trust in the United States not even a year after America's 47th president took office. Double tap. As we begin today's episode, we've got to concede that we just made a fairly bold claim that if the United States is found to have engaged in an overt second strike, that revelation would put an end to any remaining trust in Washington. But in order to understand why these strikes matter so much, we've got to set the scene, and for our American viewers who may be fans of Hegseth or his commander-in-chief, we'd encourage you to put aside, for a moment, whether or not you believe the upcoming criticism of Trump and Hegseth to be fair. Whether they're fair or not, they're what the Trump administration is dealing with not even a year into its tenure. Around the world, prior to these latest revelations about America's Caribbean operations, trust in the United States has already been fracturing among some of Washington's closest and oldest allies. The United Kingdom, long regarded as America's closest friend in the world, no longer shares intelligence with the US that could facilitate these sorts of strikes. The nations of the NATO alliance have regularly been horrified with Trump's rollbacks of Ukraine aid, his overt outreach to Vladimir Putin, and most recently his explicit choice to exclude Europe from the ongoing series of peace negotiations. Japan, Australia, and South Korea have seen a massive loss of faith in Washington from their respective peoples, and longtime US allies in Latin America, like the nation of Colombia, are now openly opposing the decisions being made in the White House. And ever since the start of Washington's pressure campaign against the nation of Venezuela, that trust has started to erode faster and faster. According to the United States, its operations in the Caribbean are currently aimed at targeting narco-traffickers who use small motorboats to ferry addictive and often deadly drugs to US soil. At the same time, however, the US has routinely declined to actually share any evidence that the boats it's targeting or the people who are being killed on board those boats are proven to be narco-traffickers. In the rare instances that survivors have returned to Latin American nations, there hasn't been nearly enough evidence to charge them with narco-trafficking crimes. Recent reports in the United States suggest that military service members involved with the strikes have sought their own outside legal counsel, trying to figure out whether they'd be committing crimes by following the orders given to them. Over the last few weeks, a handful of Democratic lawmakers, and especially Senator Mark Kelly, have been under fire from the White House after they released a video explaining to US troops that, quote, "Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders." The Trump administration has threatened to recall Kelly, a retired naval aviator, to service in order to court-martial him, although most legal experts agree that it would be very difficult to actually prosecute Kelly for what he said, and don't judge that Kelly broke the law in any way. We explain all of that context because when the Washington Post released its report on the 28th of November, it was basically dumping a barrel of lighter fluid onto a burning bonfire. The allegations within that report trace back to the 2nd of September, when the US launched its very first airstrike on a suspected drug smuggling boat in the Caribbean. At the time that it was hit with the first airstrike, that boat was carrying 11 people on board, a number that experts at the time pointed out as unusual for a drug-running boat. Where the emphasis, rather predictably, is to carry drugs, but is really more consistent with a boat filled with migrants. Again, the United States has not attempted to offer conclusive proof that those 11 people were narco-traffickers, but it alleges that, based on their own internal assessments, they were members of the gang Tren de Aragua. According to the Washington Post's report, once the boat was hit the first time, military intelligence was able to ascertain that at least 2 people had survived the strike and were holding onto the wreckage of their boat. At that time, again as alleged by the report, Hegseth issued a verbal command to military officials to, quote, kill everybody. That second strike then took place at Hegseth's direction and was carried out by America's renowned Naval SEAL Team 6, the same unit that killed Osama bin Laden. Now we're going to discuss Hegseth's and the White House's conflicting version of events, as well as the fallout from the report. But before we do, we've got to make very clear, if the Washington Post version of things is accurate, then Hegseth and his subordinates would almost certainly be understood to have committed a war crime. Specifically, they carried out what's known as a double tap, in which a first military action renders all enemy combatants incapable of posing any risk to their adversary, but a second follow-up action claims the lives of the enemy combatants who survived, despite the lack of any remaining threat. That's not speculation from us here at WarFronts, that's the judgment of even America's former military lawyers, a section of the US Armed Forces that was purged at the start of the Trump administration. According to a prominent working group, quote, "The former JAGS working group unanimously considers both the giving and the execution of these orders, if true, to constitute war crimes, murder, or both." End quote. According to their judgment, if the US is engaged in a, quote, non-international armed conflict, which is what the US claims, then the killing of survivors of a prior strike is illegal under international law. If the US isn't in an armed conflict, then it's just straight-up murder, using the tools of lethal force available to the US military. Quoting again, "Since orders to kill survivors of an attack at sea are patently illegal, anyone who issues or follows such orders can and should be prosecuted for war crimes, murder, or both." End quote. Now, depending on the force of the domestic and international outcry against these purported actions, you'd be well within your rights to ask why this is a war crime. After all, if we take Washington's premise that these were dangerous narco-traffickers and the goal of the strikes was to kill them, then the US was simply finishing the job. Except, under the international laws that exist today, that isn't how it works. Under the Geneva Convention, the Hague Convention, and other international treaties, it is outright prohibited to target those who've been taken out of the fight by wounds or incapacitation, or to declare a state of no quarter, meaning that mercy won't be offered to an adversary who's been defeated. Are those international laws of war always followed? No, absolutely not. I mean, just look at Ukraine, Sudan, the Congo, Myanmar, or most of the other conflict zones around the world. But following those laws, even when other fighting powers don't, has been central to the warfighting doctrine of the US and its allies for many decades. The rationale isn't simply benevolent either. Instead, the hope is that if you don't engage in these kinds of strikes against adversaries, then adversaries won't engage in these kinds of strikes against you. Nor is this a situation where, say, a group of armed insurgents was hit with an airstrike, but a few people survived and tried to scurry away into hiding. If the allegations against Washington are true, then the people targeted in the strike were left entirely exposed with no capacity to fight or inflict harm upon the United States, and under those same international laws, they would have been captured as prisoners of war. Now, before we move on, we've got to take a brief pause and make the sort of pivot that you can only find here on WarFronts. From internationally condemned allegations of war crimes to our merchandise. Do you like learning about global conflicts and geopolitical quagmires? Do you like supporting the work of our WarFronts team? Do you like it when people take one look at you and think to themselves, now they know a little something about what's happening across the globe? And if you answered yes to any of those questions, then we've got exactly the gear for you. Perhaps you're partial to a t-shirt, a sweatshirt, or a notebook. Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your allegiance to the Department of WarFronts. Yes, we're really riding a fine line today. Or perhaps you could use a few stickers to raise morale on the home front. Maybe you'd like to tell us, with your dollars, as well as your comments, that you want to see some damn weep fronts. Either way, we have exactly what you're looking for. Head over to store.fronts.co, that's store.fronts.co, or visit the store section on this very YouTube channel. Everything you purchase helps us do what we do and make more content like this while you get to strut about town like the big-brain geopolitics nerd that you are. One more time, that's store.fronts.co, or the store page here on WarFronts. And now, back to it. The fallout. It's at this point in the story today that we'd like to provide what we assume will be the least surprising revelation of this entire episode. Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump, and the White House do not agree with the idea that they've committed any war crimes. But we'd be remiss not to mention that despite the consistent stance that he did nothing wrong, the earliest denials from Hegseth don't really match up with what he or the Trump administration are saying now. Immediately after the story broke, Hegseth tore into the Washington Post, accusing it of publishing, quote, fake news delivering more fabricated, inflammatory, and derogatory reporting to discredit our incredible warriors fighting to protect our homeland. As we said from the beginning and in every statement, these highly effective strikes are specifically intended to be lethal kinetic strikes. The declared intent is to stop lethal drugs, destroy narco boats, and kill the narco terrorists who are poisoning the American people. Every trafficker we kill is affiliated with a designated terrorist organization. End quote. The Pentagon's lead spokesman, Sean Parnell, chimed in with his own defense of his boss, quote, this entire narrative is completely false. Ongoing operations to dismantle narco-terrorism and to protect the homeland from deadly drugs have been a resounding success. But by the following Monday, the White House was issuing an amended set of statements. When asked whether the White House denied that a double-tap strike occurred or denied that Hegseth was responsible, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt responded, quote, the latter is true, before explaining, quoting again, Secretary Hegseth authorized Admiral Bradley to conduct those kinetic strikes, end quote. The Admiral Bradley in question is Frank Bradley, a commander of the United States Special Operations Command, who directly oversaw the strikes, as acknowledged in the initial Washington Post report. In fact, that report also spoke to Bradley's reasoning, explaining that well-placed sources had said that, quote, Bradley viewed the survivors as legitimate targets, as they could possibly call other traffickers to come and get them and their cargo, end quote. After blame shifted to Bradley for ordering the second strike, Hegseth came publicly to his defense, calling the Admiral, quote, an American hero, a true professional, and has my 100% support. Hegseth added, I stand by him and the combat decisions he has made on the September 2nd mission and all others since, end quote. On a Tuesday meeting of Trump's cabinet, Hegseth stated that he had watched the first strike on the alleged drug boat on that day, but didn't wait around for the following hours before the second strike. Quote, a couple of hours later, I learned that commander had made the decision which he had the complete authority to do. He sunk the boat and eliminated the threat, and it was the right call. End quote. Hegseth also appears to have the support of his commander-in-chief, quoting Trump when he was asked about the strikes, Pete didn't know about the second attack having to do with two people. Over the weekend, Trump also noted, quoting again, no, I wouldn't have wanted that, not a second strike. And while we're on the subject of things that happened over the weekend, we'd be remiss not to mention that Hegseth posted an AI-generated image of a children's storybook character, Franklin the Turtle, firing a rocket launcher onto drug boats while sitting off the side of a military helicopter. We live in really strange times. Regardless, US lawmakers have indicated that they're ready to charge ahead with subsequent investigations. The top-ranking Republican and Democrat on the US House Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers and Adam Smith respectively, announced that they'll launch an inquiry into what happened, while the US Senate will do the same, also in a bipartisan effort. Hegseth is facing intense pressure from members of his own party, including Senator Rand Paul, who claimed in the aftermath, quote, either he was lying to us or he's incompetent and didn't know it had happened. Also on the Republican side of Washington, there was Senator Tom Tillis quoting, you don't have to have served in the military to understand that that was a violation of ethical, moral, and legal code. And so, if the facts play out the way they're currently being reported, then somebody needs to get the hell out of Washington. The human rights chief of the United Nations has urged Washington to thoroughly investigate what happened, emphasizing the real possibility that extrajudicial killings took place, while predictably Democratic lawmakers in the US have issued forceful condemnations of Hegseth's alleged actions. As for the penalties that Hegseth and other people within his chain of command could ultimately face, there are two ways to look at the situation. On the one hand, international precedent would indicate that Hegseth and his subordinates could be handed as much as the death penalty. A foundational case on this issue, the war crimes trial following the 1944 sinking of the Greek ship Peleus by a U-boat fighting on the behalf of Nazi Germany, saw 3 Nazi officers hanged as punishment for ordering survivors from the Peleus to be shot in the water. In reality, however, it's been a very long time since an international leader of Hegseth's status has faced anywhere near that level of scrutiny, and for the United States in particular, allowing Hegseth to go to trial would be absolutely unthinkable. Under the American Service Members Protection Act passed in 2002, the United States grants the president the legal authority to use, quote, all means necessary and appropriate to free and recover any US or allied personnel who might be detained or imprisoned by the International Criminal Court. There's a reason that the measure is nicknamed the Hague Invasion Act, in reference to a hypothetical operation that the law literally entitles America's president to approve. And we've got to be very clear, the allegations against Hegseth and his subordinates are, at this time, precisely that. They are allegations with nowhere near enough evidence yet presented in order to meet any burden of proof. But if the mood on Capitol Hill is any indication, Hegseth will be subjected to thorough investigations. If the findings of those inquiries are substantial enough that US legislators could take bipartisan action against him, then it's not clear that anything less than a presidential pardon would get Hegseth out of this. In the meantime, even these allegations by themselves, without any indisputable proof, will likely be enough to erase any remaining faith in the Trump administration's commitments to international law in the eyes of America's allies. After all, even as the White House denies that Hegseth was complicit, it's building a case to justify and endorse the idea of a double-tap strike. International leaders, it would seem, are far from convinced by their rationale, and if those leaders believe that America is engaged in war crimes, then there's no telling how their posture toward the US could change. Thank you for watching.